Right, I think we'll kick off now. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Olivia. We're really excited to have you join us today for this London Climate Action Week webinar on energy efficiency in commercial properties, obviously with building energy experts, that's us. A little bit of housekeeping. Any questions that you have, please do pop them in the Q&A box or the chat, and then we'll get round to answering them at the end. Yeah, I'm going to hand over to Jack now. Who'll be presenting the webinar. He's the Managing Director of Building Energy Experts. So over to you now, Jack.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. Sorry, I was just trying to sort out the screen there so everything didn't pop up. I'm just going to get it onto the correct one. Great. Can you see that, Olivia? See the screen sharing? Excellent. There we go. I hope I can get rid of that. There we go. Hi, I'm Jack Allen, Managing Director of Building Energy Experts, and I've been working in sustainability in the built environment from commercial decarbonisation through to new build and retrofit for the past 15 years. Just a quick introduction to Building Energy Experts. I founded Building Energy Experts with a particular focus on real-world building performance. And the idea of which was to bring in detailed building testing techniques. Sorry, Olivia, there's still lots of people just joining in. Shall I start?
Yeah, no worries. I'm letting people in as we come in. But just to say again, it will be recorded, so don't worry if you've missed anything. If you're joining late, everything will be sent over.
Great, cool. Yeah, I'll carry on. Including testing and analysis techniques to really uncover the performance gap between desk-based modelling and real-world performance. Over the next 50 minutes or so, I hope to raise awareness of why commercial energy efficiency, in particular retrofit, is a driver of resilience, and that it's a commercial investment rather than just regulatory compliance. We'll also have a look at what's working through a real-world project example, and explore some pathways to action for anyone managing commercial property. It's always good to start with why, and why is energy efficiency so urgent, and why particularly in terms of commercial property. First off, there's the climate imperative, which we can't get away from. Climate change is undeniable facts. 2024 was the warmest year on record, and we've already broken some of those records in 2025. We've already passed the 1.5 threshold we were aiming for not reaching by 2050 last year, unfortunately. And the past 10 years consecutively been the warmest 10 years on record since records began. And the amount of damage we see from wildfires, flooding and crop failure seems to get more and more every day. And apart from that, sort of the human side, there was a Forbes report last year which estimated that the actual financial cost of climate change in 2024 was actually $38 trillion, not $1 million, which is enormous. So when people say, can we afford net zero? It's like, I would say, can we afford not to do with net zero? Because the alternative would be much more expensive. Now, translating that through to commercial property, and what is the urgent need for retrofit? Well, we've got a UK legally binding net zero target of 2050, and we've committed to achieving 68% reduction by 2030. The built environment accounts for 40% of our overall emissions, and it's also one of the easiest areas to deal with because industry or transport, for instance, are a lot harder to decarbonise than buildings, where we actually have all of the solutions we need to create zero carbon buildings at our fingertips. They just need to be employed. Commercial operational carbon, so that's the energy used for heating, cooling our buildings, ventilating them, accounts for 23% of the built environment's 40% of emissions, and 12% of the emissions are made up from embodied carbon from fit outs and new build commercial property. Furthermore, people quite often think that commercial properties have short lifespans with sort of 60-year predicted, and that new property will be built, which will be nice and energy efficient. But 70% of the commercial buildings we use in 2050 have already been built, and at least 80% of these will require retrofit to be anywhere near the targets we need to reach our net zero target of 2050. And we're currently retrofitting between 1 and 1.5% of our
Hi,
commercial.
Jack. Sorry to interrupt. I don't think the slides have changed on our end. If you want to just
There
check.
we go.
There we go.
Oh, sorry. Got to click the buttons. We're currently retrofitting 1 to 1.5% per year, and they're not necessarily being retrofitted to the correct energy targets. And this rate needs to reach 5% to meet the goals. Here is a great little graph made by the UK Green Building Council, which shows all of the different sources of carbon from the commercial built environment and where we need to get to. A lot of the current improvements which have come down here have actually been from moving away from coal and going towards gas. So it's not necessarily as good as it looks in terms of where we've got to. And if we carry on as we are, without significant improvement, that dotted line is where we'll end up, as opposed to where we need to, right down in the bottom right hand corner here. One of the key drivers, which will always be there, is regulatory compliance. The net zero emissions targets will presumably bring a lot more of these, although they have been light so far, especially as the last government were very slow to bring things in and change their mind a lot. But the minimum energy efficiency standards, which were brought in, which require buildings to be above an F or G, so a minimum of an E, are currently in place. And they plan to, well, they're consulting on planning to bring that up to a C by 2027 and a B by 2030, which would be a significant difference to where we are right now. And it would see up to 70% of commercial properties are currently below a B, so would require a significant amount of improvement. There's also the ESOS reporting requirements for larger corporations of over 250 people or over 42 million turnover. And the government's also consulting on a performance-based policy for buildings over 1,000 meters squared, which would require them to report on their energy use. So I just thought I'd touch on peak heat demand. There seems to be a lot out there at the moment about just electrification and just going for solar and electrifying heat supply, but we can't meet peak heat demand with electrification on cold January, February mornings when we need all of that heating to heat up all of our domestic and commercial buildings. It currently all comes from, or a large amount of that comes from gas, as can be seen by the graph in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen with that red peaking line that follows the temperature line, all coming from gas. Gas is a great fuel source because it can be stored stably in big tanks, not doing anything, ready to use any time. Electricity, unfortunately, isn't like that, and the renewable generation doesn't follow our heating demand in any way. So without a cost prohibitive amount of battery storage, the only option with electrification is to significantly improve our energy efficiency in terms of being able to reach that peak heat demand in those cold winter months. Apart from the practical and environmental imperatives, there's also a strong commercial case now for decarbonising buildings and making them more energy efficient. Starting with energy savings, since 2021, energy costs for businesses have gone up on an average of 90%. This translates to an overall average cost increase of 11%. With energy intensive businesses quite often working on very fine margins, this is a significant amount. I put this little graph in here of the Brent crude oil in the past 30 days just to show what happens when there's any kind of political instability. And we've had a lot of that from COVID causing oil prices to crash in the early 2020, to the Ukraine war causing it to go crazily high, and in the last 30 days, just the action in Iran shows that suddenly the oil prices go straight up. The commercial property don't have the price caps that domestic property does, so leaving businesses which haven't got fixed price deals at the mercy of the energy prices. And on the right, it shows the energy price over the last several years. It shows it really peaking in the last 3 or 4 years. Furthermore, retrofitting is a powerful way for organisations to meet their environmental, social, governance goals. A lot of big companies now have very strict ESG policies, which they insist upon. So if buildings don't meet those levels of EPC level or BREEAM in use level or neighbours rating, then some of the biggest companies, blue chip companies, just won't sign up to leases. But they'll also pay a lot more for properties that do have those certifications and are energy efficient. And a retrofitted building on that basis is also a future-proofed asset, and it could also give potentially have a lot higher yields. There's something people are talking about now called a green premium, which suggests an increased value of 15 to 20% on retrofitted greener properties, energy efficient properties. And also people talk of the brown discount and stranded asset risk of inefficient buildings which are below the MEES standards, which you can't rent out and can't sell. Therefore, their value is going to drop off significantly. There's also a big benefit in terms of attracting talent. People want to be in energy efficient buildings. Energy efficient buildings are nicer to be in, and everybody wants to see that the company they're working for is caring for the environment as well. And on that note, health and well-being, efficient buildings and retrofit done well, or even new build buildings that are built to the correct standard, means improvements in air quality, enhanced thermal comfort, and these lead to things like less absenteeism and increased productivity. If it's well retrofitted, it's much less chance it's going to have condensation, damp, mold. And also, if considered correctly through the retrofitting process, minimizing overheating risk, but that requires overheating risk to be considered properly, as well as the opportunity to do things such as add improved natural light. So what exactly is retrofit, and what do the different approaches involve? First off, building optimization. And this is the crucial initial phase in retrofitting, and it focuses on improving existing buildings' performance and operations before significant structural service changes are undertaken. So it's sort of maximizing what's currently there without making any changes. And recent studies have shown that done right, this can produce a saving of 26%. And this can be due to the set points being wrong on the heating, cooling systems, faulty sensors, just systems not being optimized generally across the board. So it's always the best place to start, and it leads well into the light retrofit approach, which is the next stage, and has some sort of crossover with the optimization stage. And this is where you look at new building management systems and controls, insulating pipe works, lighting upgrades and controls, energy efficient equipment replacements, upgrades to the M&E and the plumbing systems, and any sort of non-disruptive fabric measures. Sort of the key to light retrofit is that the standard building operation can carry on as you're doing it, and it usually has a very good return on investment. And combined with the optimization stage, light retrofit and optimization together can deliver 37% of efficiency savings, and they'll typically have very good return on investment. So it's always worth doing and doing as soon as possible. Then we go on to deep retrofit. And so for further savings, deep retrofits often required, particularly in older buildings with uninsulated building fabric. And it involves making larger changes, such as potentially new facade, new openings, windows and doors, roof insulation, floor insulation. One key thing with deep retrofit is to consider it in line with your repairs and maintenance schedule. For instance, if the roof does need replacing because it's leaking, make sure that new roof that goes on is well insulated and has a PV array if possible. And so combine it with what the normal building cycle. The UK Green Building Council has got a good commercial guide for delivering net zero, and it sets out these 10 key considerations. And it's a very good guide, and I recommend anyone downloads that or any of their other tools because they are an excellent organisation. And I thought I'd add this in just because it's a great place to start. So first off, understanding the building, and that's getting a clear picture of how the building uses energy and what its current environmental impact is. And then next up is figuring out what's needed. Do a thorough check of the building's structure, systems, and how to pinpoint specific areas for improvement. Then it's about building your case, thinking about how these upgrades will help with the new rules, and also if they can save you money or bring other benefits like making the building more attractive to rent. Also knowing about the roadblocks and opportunities, being aware of potential challenges, like the split incentive, which is where landlords often pay for improvements because 85% of our building stock is rented out, and tenants typically get the benefit of those improvements. So how do you overcome that split incentive, and which part of the lease and who pays is one of the key roadblocks. So making sure that's translated and worked out early is great. Next, setting clear goals. Decide what you want to achieve, like reducing energy by a certain amount per floor area, or hitting a certain EPC, or ideally not EPC and do it in actual energy, and then track your progress so you can clearly demonstrate it. Next would be sorry. If you have multiple buildings, try and pick an approach and try and get a sort of standardized plan to roll out across the portfolio, because that will make things much more efficient. And then optimize the management by start by making sure your building's existing systems are running as efficiently as possible, and regularly check energy use. Next, upgrade systems and structure. Look at putting in energy efficient heating, cooling and lighting, and also improve insulation, air tightness and windows. 9, think about materials. Choose materials that have lower embodied carbon, and consider reusing or recycling existing parts of the building if you can. And finally, and very importantly, monitoring and keep monitoring after the upgrades to make sure you can measure and demonstrate the benefits of the retrofit. Takes us on to how to approach retrofit. To really improve a building's energy use, you need to fully understand it. It's like a doctor doing a checkup before prescribing medicine. And what you need to do, essentially, and why it's so crucial, is you can't fix what you don't understand. If you don't know how much a building is using or why, you'll make bad choices. You've got to get the right information, look at the old energy bills, how many people use the building, and exactly how they use it. 2 buildings can be, on the face of it, exactly the same, but if they have a completely different occupancy pattern, like it's used in the evenings versus the mornings, then it can behave completely differently. Getting a professional opinion is key, and having experts do an energy audit and a full health check of the building to determine exactly how it's used and how the heating, cooling and ventilation systems all interact, and making sure they dig into the details, finding all the building manuals, reports and systems and making sure they're correct, not just using the sort of loose assumptions in the energy modelling software. Also, there's some often natural advantages that buildings can use, such as using natural light rather than lighting, natural ventilation methods, and using the current materials on site where possible. Also, really key to identify initial measures and spot easy fixes first. Identify simple ways that save energy that really don't cost anything. There's always a few of those to spot in pretty much every building. And then follow a good plan and use existing frameworks that work well. PAS 2038, which we'll go on to discuss, is one of those frameworks. And there are other such frameworks and guides out there that can help. Another key thing and something we're really keen on here is detailed testing regime. We quite often do our initial energy assessment, but then we'll like to specify things like thermal imaging, air tightness tests, and cavity wall inspections on the intrusive level, and also deploy temperature and humidity monitoring into the building to really understand exactly what's happening in the building. These are not potentially that clear images, but this was one where we didn't actually get that far with, because we solved the problem quite quickly, but it was a music school in a big auditorium, and it was very cold and they couldn't get their heat, their internal temperature up to the correct heat, and people were complaining about being particularly cold in this seated area here. And it turned out that an old ventilation hatch was completely open just beneath here, with a big pipe leading straight to the outside. So in the winter it would come straight through here and all the way around at EES level. It's completely unsealed. So when we did an air test and used thermography, we saw that was really cold. They actually fixed both of these massive gaps. The air tightness came down to a good level, and their existing heating system was able to provide enough heat. So there's quite often small fixes or small individual building problems which would never be picked up by any sort of assumptions in a modelling software. Once you've collected all of that, the raw data, and ideally more detailed data if you can, it's then important to analyze and model this using the correct and the best tools possible. Using the detailed information, we were able to produce more accurate modelling that results in more appropriate energy efficiency measures being specified, which should have less chance of there being a performance gap and better real world performance. Once you finish the energy modelling and the improvement option evaluation, and this isn't always a completely linear process, you're often sort of going back and forward and working into the design stage and back. Developing a robust retrofit plan is the next stage, and it is the key process to progressing. And initially making sure you identify the quick wins, then the medium-term upgrades, and then the long-term interventions. And it's crucial that this plan works with the client to make sure you know their budgets, the current lease status and tenancy of the building, and when it is the correct time to implement each different improvement. The key elements of the plan are defining the performance targets, and then eliminating fossil fuels, which can require a lot of building services. Well, obviously going to require building services upgrades if you're currently on gas, but also might require fabric upgrades to be able to deliver the correct temperature, and also make it feasible in terms of cost. Overheating management through the process, advanced control systems, metering and monitoring strategy, always key. Moisture management, particularly if there are any ventilation changes and fabric changes, ensuring you consider how moisture works and how it goes through each of those building makeups, and you're not going to cause any interstitial damp or cold spots is a really key element. And then creating a really good installation sequence, so make sure everything's put in the correct manner, so it doesn't affect other measures negatively, and measures are already in before the next one, so it's all controlled. And furthermore, material selection and circularity. There's no point in trying to sort of green bling if it costs a lot more in terms of embodied carbon to put in. So making sure that that's really considered when all materials are chosen. And next is adhering to standards such as 2038 to eliminate more of the risk, and also continuous improvement, which is monitoring and continuing to improve, making sure any adjustments are made. There are several key benchmarking tools and assessment tools. Energy performance certificates, which get a lot of flack. If they're done correctly, they're not too bad. One of the main problems with them is they're not done very well. Quite often in commercial properties, the floor area will be out by 30, 40%. You wonder if anyone ever even went to the building, because it doesn't really reflect what you see when you go there. So basing it on energy performance certificates is fine, as long as you know it's being done properly and the energy and the information has been put in well. And they're developed by by SBEM software, Simplified Building Energy Methodology. And so they're not a bad tool, they're not the best tool, but it's one of the only standardized tool which goes across all commercial property. So it can be useful when used properly. Next is display energy certificates. These actually model the actual used energy per year in terms of gas and electricity. They're a requirement for all public sector buildings. So you'll see them in the way into schools and libraries, etc. But they're rarely used for commercial buildings. They are a good way to benchmark where your building stands, especially if there isn't a smart monitoring system in there already. It's a good way to do it. It's also a good way to a metric to improve upon. And then going on from that, essentially going more complex than the simplified building energy modeling is creating dynamic simulation models, which is just a more complex way of modeling the energy, and that creates more accuracy. And then there are other standards like the PAS 2038, which is the British standard for retrofit of non-domestic buildings, which I highly recommend. It's a great standard, probably better standard than the 2035 domestic one. And it works in conjunction with other things such as the Neighbours UK, which is an energy benchmarking system which came from Australia originally. But this is a UK version which currently only applies to offices, but is very useful in terms of comparing your energy use to other comparable buildings in the area. And there's also the new UK net zero building standard, as well as things like BREEAM in use, which is often required. Okay. So I just thought I'd go into a bit more detail on PAS 2038. It's like a really good instruction manual for making older commercial buildings much more energy efficient. And it's designed to improve the energy efficiency whilst also avoiding any unintended consequences and ironing out any risks that might come from poorly thought out or poorly designed energy efficiency improvement, as well as improving the overall quality of the installation of the work. Everybody needs to be certified to PAS 2030 to work on it, to make sure they've got the right qualifications and they're experienced, as well as reducing the environmental impact and improving the functionality of buildings, whilst also protecting the listed and heritage elements of that building. A significant proportion of commercial emissions, more than a third, comes from the embodied carbon associated with construction and fit out. Therefore, for truly sustainable retrofit decisions, a whole life carbon assessment is essential. It enables you to consider everything that's already in that building and how it could best be reused before it's replaced with anything new. And also, if anything new is coming in, making the best decision about the lowest embodied carbon for those new systems or materials that you specify on that building. The main one, probably, there's several really good examples of this, is reusing existing structures, particularly big concrete structures. Quite often we'll see this now, just buildings being stripped back to the concrete structure and then rebuilt. Ideally save more than that, but even if it's just saving the concrete structure, if it's structurally sound, will save thousands of tons of carbon. Another key thing that's often not considered, particularly in a warming world, is overheating. As we make the buildings more energy efficient and we insulate them more, it's also key that we consider that overheating risk. We also declared a climate emergency, and part of that legislation, there's a legal requirement to consider the risk from the warming climate and produce mitigation strategies. And two of the main risks would be overheating and flooding for that. Cooling demand is predicted to increase by 50% by 2030 over the 2004 baseline. Cooling is being put into more buildings, and the data shows that when cooling is in buildings, cooling just gets used. So on average, well, often cooling will be on for sort of 10 months of the year, despite only really being needed for a few months, just because it's quite nice to sit in a constant temperature all year round, and the occupants don't know how to set the controls, or they haven't been set for them. So it results in a lot of extra energy being used. There's a serious element to overheating. The most recent severe heat wave of 2022 caused 4,500 excess deaths. But there's also the loss of productivity and the risk to people with health concerns. But it costs a lot of money to lose that productivity and have people trying to work in much too warm conditions. There are Part O building regulations which address overheating. However, these are only applicable to buildings where people would sleep overnight. So in commercial buildings, that sort of multi-residential, healthcare institutions which have to consider those, and it's only for new builds. Otherwise, there isn't, the building regulations aren't enforcing any kind of overheating check. It doesn't mean it's not crucial that it should be done. And any sort of retrofit project, particularly when anything's being done to the facade where any sort of shading changes can be made or ventilation changes, it's crucial to consider overheating and consider doing a dynamic thermal modeling, because that enables you to have greater design flexibility and really model what that building is going to be like when it's finished. And the key to preventing overheating is stopping heat from getting in. So if you've got south or west facing rooms, integrating a good shading system into that retrofit is going to be significantly cheaper than having to go back at a later date, try and do something, or from installing carbon intensive active cooling. When considering the cooling of the building, it's important to follow the cooling hierarchy, which I was sort of alluding to just then. And the first element of that is eliminating unwanted solar gains. So effective shading strategies. It's not something we do very often in this country because we haven't really needed to, but it's something we need to think about more and more. If you go to Europe, you see shading on all buildings, and it's something that we used to have in the past before the advent of cheap cooling. So that's something we need to get back to. Next is minimizing heat gains from the internal equipment as well as from heating systems, making sure all pipe work is insulated, etc. And and then it's down to managing the heat well in the building using passive ventilation or mechanical ventilation techniques where possible. And the last resort should always be active cooling. There's going to be a lot more pressure on our grid for electrification of everything from vehicles to buildings. So we can do without the additional requirement of huge amounts of cooling where possible. Now we're going to go over a quick case study. This is about a health centre in Bristol. They have a goal to get to zero carbon as quickly as possible, and their boiler was reaching the end of its life, so they were considering a heat pump, but they got a quote for a heat pump, and it was sort of £500,000 versus new boilers, which were around £30,000, and they just didn't have the money to do the heat pumps, but they equally wanted to make the building as sustainable as possible and determine whether or not heat pumps would be possible for the future. So we approached this by doing a PAS 2038 condition report, gathering all of the data from the site, as well as a commercial EPC to benchmark it, and gathering the energy use data. They only had annual energy use data. They didn't have it broken down any more than that, so we didn't get too much insight from that. But then once we'd done that initial stage, we also commissioned more further testing. We did a thermal imaging assessment, an air tightness test, and a cavity wall inspection, because there was very little data. There were no plans of how the building was built. Part of it was built in the late 50s, and then there was another extension in the 90s or early 90s, and we didn't know what was there. So we commissioned these further tests to find out more. And then once all that correct data was done, we created a dynamic simulation model to model the energy and overheating risk. Sorry, I didn't step onto that slide, so that's what that slide was. And one of the interesting things we found was that the EPC, as stated on their EPC certificate on the government website, was C54, but it should have been an E106 if the person who'd done that original EPC had done it correctly, which is a massive gap. The floor area was completely wrong. They'd used a lot of assumptions and sort of wonder if they'd been to the building really, because it was very badly done, which you find quite often. The air tightness was over 25, which is enormous. They just had a false ceiling with hardly any insulation above it, just leading to the ventilated roof space. So despite taking two large fans with easily enough capacity to pressurize it, we couldn't even get it up to pressure to get a valid test. The result was showing around 28, which is like having a few huge windows open. So your heat is just going out, and the occupants had found that as well, because the upstairs occupants were too cold in the winter, and the downstairs ones were not finding it so bad. We found the cavity was uninsulated and fairly clear, which was a good thing to find out from our cavity inspection. And through the thermal imaging, as well as some intrusive surveys and looking up in the roof, we found the loft insulation was sporadic and insufficient. It had been moved around to do some wiring and never put back, so large areas were completely missing. And there was also significant overheating risk in the south and west facing rooms, which was backed up by the feedback from the occupants as well, saying that those rooms were almost too hot to work in summer months. So we conducted an improvement option evaluation, considering all potential building fabric and building service measures, which we deemed appropriate for the building, along with any shade. We also did a shading model and added in some shading to the external windows on the south and west faces. And on the right is the impact of these measures. once we started this, the existing boiler actually packed up, so there was no option other than replace that. So here it goes to all the other measures are with the first measure, second measure from the bottom, the new more efficient gas boilers, and then all the other measures are stacked upon that, but they're all with that in place because we didn't have any option. They didn't have any option as to replace that. So we considered additional solar PV because they already had quite a lot on the roof, insulating flat roof, replacing doors, insulating sloping roofs, insulating loft walls, adding shading to the south elevation and removing the air conditioning units if that worked, insulate the ceiling plane, sub-metering, replacement of the double glazed windows, which were quite often the seals had gone. They weren't performing very well. The thermal imaging survey showed they were not really working how they should be, but they were 25 years old. Cavity wall retrofitted insulation was deemed appropriate, as well as replacing non-LED lighting, lighting controls, and then improving the air tightness, and finally putting in heating controls. The health centre's budgets were very stretched, and the gas boilers broke, as I said, but we worked with them to create a plan, a 15-year plan. Initially, they wanted to get to zero carbon, but budgets weren't going to allow for that. So working with them, we developed an existing plan to get them to an EPC A rating with an 81% reduction in operational carbon. And that was based upon installing sufficient fabric measures to enable the installation of that air source heat pump when these new gas boilers come to the end of their life. And their quote for £500,000 for an air source heat pump, which was completely financially unfeasible, was based on changing the whole wet system because of the heat demand and the heat delivery system to every room, requiring a whole new one. But if they do insulate and make the building much more airtight and slowly plan for all of these other measures, by 15 years' time, providing the wet delivery system is still in working order, they would be able to switch out to an air source heat pump without having to put much bigger heat emitters into each room, which would save them a significant amount of money. Right, so key learnings from this project and others is that comprehensive tailored energy assessments are crucial before undertaking any upgrades. I've seen so many sort of desk-based reports which we've got before we've gone and actually done investigative things on some buildings which are far from what's actually there. So doing that is really important, and that includes real-world testing such as air tests, thermal imaging, etc., to provide real data for effective solutions. Sometimes air tests and thermal imaging can provide really cheap, effective solutions, and when you in buildings like heritage buildings where you're not really able to change much of the fabric anyway, you can often really understand what the problems are or block up certain areas which are causing a lot of the convectional heat loss. Next is strategic energy efficiency upgrades can significantly improve EPC ratings, reduce operational costs, and enhance the asset value. Effective planning and expert guidance are essential to secure funding and navigate complex regulations. There's not a huge amount of funding out there at the moment, other than self-funded, but especially with the end of the PSDS, the Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme. But we'd hope that more funding and more support for business to decarbonise will be available in the near future. Heritage properties in particular require specialist assessment, and often it's a real benefit to work under frameworks like PAS 2038. It doesn't seem to be specified by more than a couple of councils to my knowledge. I think maybe Norfolk, but it is a really good goal, and it really does help eliminate risk, ensure the conservation goals are achieved at the same time alongside energy efficiency, as well as using targeted diagnostics to pinpoint specific issues like heat loss and air leakage, which I've sort of just already alluded to. And finally, make sure you consider overheating risk in all retrofit projects, because it's a key thing to do, and it's going to be much more cost effective to do it at that time. Finally, next steps: start with an assessment, develop a strategy, seek expert guidance, iterate and monitor, and finally, energy efficient retrofit shouldn't be seen as a problem. It should be seen as an investment opportunity to create a more valuable asset. Right, and that brings us on to the Q&A section.
Yeah, great. Thank you everyone for listening. If you have any questions at this point, it seems like we've got about 10 minutes or so left. So if you can pop them in the chat or the Q&A box, then we'll get around to them. I'll give you a few seconds, and if no one has any, then I definitely have some of my own to ask. Oh, I think we've got one now. Jack, would you want me to read that out from the Q&A box, or are you able to see that question?
I can probably do that. So I didn't have that up.
No worries.
How would you split the current retrofit focused companies in what they're offering between stage 1, improving existing performance, light retrofit, and stage 2, deep retrofitting stage? I think it's a good idea to consider all of the stages in the initial assessment stage and plan for all of them depending on what stage that building is at. And the optimization and light retrofitting, I would say, could probably financially be justified in most cases, whereas the deep retrofitting stage, where it's going to cause a lot of disruption, really needs to be planned in terms of the long-term maintenance and upgrade, and in terms of the overall building's tenancy, I would say, for that.
Then there's a couple from George in there if you scroll down as well.
Yeah. From a lender's perspective, with borrowers that manage properties in secondary market who target SME tenants, how might you suggest encouraging them to improve their property as energy efficiency? The initial required capex tends to shy them away from improving their properties, and the general improvement for a gain in reputation does not tend to be a priority for them. I think that's a really good point, and I think a lot of the stuff you hear is from like the key central London property, which has come a long way, and there's loads of amazing stories about it. But most property is actually out of London or out of key cities like Bristol or Manchester, and how those improve is different. We had one where there was an American forklift truck company were taking a commercial building, and they said it had to be a B or they would get rid of their lease. So that made a kind of an industrial estate in a small town increase it to a B quite quickly. But that was kind of a stick method. But I think a lot of the change in any of the subprime property will probably need to come from legislation, and be more sort of more stick than carrot, I think, unless they can come up with a decent incentive, such as they could lower business rates for higher, but for better energy efficiency, or they could provide 0% borrowing, etc. But none of those have come out yet.
There's one from George as well, asking how we're able to access the PAS 2038 framework. If you've got any comments on that one, Jack.
Yes, I can send you a version of it. It's actually, you have to buy it on like one of these silly things where we release British standards and then put them behind a paywall. But if you send me an email, I'll happily send it to you.
Great. There's a new question as well from Chris Barlow, if you can see that at the top.
There we go. For calculating the insulation value of a product, we would always be creating the U value and ideally area weighted U value of a particular build-up of a building. Sorry, the question was, how do you calculate the insulation value of a product? Is it simply the declared lambda value, or do you look deeper into the insulation performs at a higher temperature above the standard 10 degrees? This can have a valid reason for choosing a product. The other thing we do is smart U value testing, where you actually put sensors either side of a wall or a build-up and check what U value it gets. We quite often do that in heritage buildings. Quite often a big, thick stone wall will get an assumed U value of 2 in energy modeling software, but depending on the microclimatic things, it can actually be as low as 1. So we often do it real life U value calculations to determine that, as well as in new build situations. You can test new build ups that have been put in to see if they're actually performing to the level that has been promised or designed. So yes, we do look into it more deeply.
If anyone's got any more questions, again, just the chat or the Q&A box, but I'm going to ask one of my own in the meantime. So say I had a pretty restricted budget, Jack, what would you suggest as the first step? Because obviously it can be quite a long journey. If I wasn't really sure where to start, what would you recommend?
Just getting the initial energy audit and getting the opinion. It could even be just getting some advice, getting someone who understands the whole process to come and suggest. That could be pre-paying for the audit if the audit was even beyond financial requirements right then. But getting someone to spend a day of their time looking around your building and giving you a suggested overarching strategy, considering your budget constraints over the next sort of 15 to 25 years, and when you should try and bring in those different services, different energy modeling, and how much it's likely to cost, so you can plan that into future budgets and afford it. I'd say that would probably be the best approach if budgets were really strained.
Great. Well, if we haven't got any more questions at the moment, I think that's probably time for us to bring this to a close. Thank you everyone for coming. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it useful. And yes, the recording will be sent out to everyone at some point in the week. And I think we'll send out, I'll send out an email as well that you can reply to RE the guidance to make sure everyone who wants it can get it. So don't worry about that. I will send out an email and we'll make sure that everyone who wants that gets that as well. So thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of the events this week.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.